Hey, Giants, do you have toxic behaviors or do you know somebody that does? You're going to want to hang tight for this episode. I was just going to start with a slew of negative things and be like, hey, the
Good
world
morning,
is terrible.
Giants. Here's some negativity.
Yeah. We got Nicole with us this morning. We are going to talk about toxicity and this term that people tend to throw around pretty frequently. You know, my workplace is toxic, my relationship is toxic, my parents are toxic, the bird down the street ate that food toxically. Like we just throw it around, and I'm wondering, Nicole, if you could kind of give us some definition, like an operational definition of what toxicity is. What does it mean to you?
To me, I think that toxic behavior is behavior that doesn't contribute to
Yeah.
anyone other than maybe yourself. So it's very self-seeking and selfish, and that's how I see it. If you're aware of it, I think that a lot of us do things, but we're not aware. What's your take on
No, I
toxic?
think we hear it most. It's almost tied and synonymous with narcissism. Like people
Mhm.
throw out that term and toxicity together. Oh, he's a narcissist or she's a narcissist, and they don't fully understand the terms in either case. And toxic behavior to me would be toxic, like behaviors that erode a relationship, like that break down a relationship, kind of like a toxic material would erode a relationship, um, or a metal. A
Yeah.
little different there, but we tend to put that toxicity out there, like it's in others. You
Mhm.
know, how come, this person is toxic, I had to move out of that relationship, or that job was toxic, so I had to move out of that job. And if you're finding that you're consistently in toxic environments, it might be time to look inward and say, what are my behaviors that are contributing to that? Because I have toxic behaviors. I have things that show up in me that I've had a realization outside of a relationship really don't belong in a relationship. Or, at work, I'd have behaviors that were not conducive, were not helpful for the environment. And
Mhm.
so I think it really does start with us. Like, how do we shift that behavior in us? Do you have some examples of what some toxic behaviors might be?
I have some for myself. And
Do
that's the
you?
cool thing.
Okay.
Because when I talk about my toxic relationship, I was part of it. So trying to fix people,
Hmm.
looking at everyone as if they're broken and I'm here to fix them. Definitely a toxic behavior, especially when you're with somebody who's struggling with something like addiction. And it's not just so easy for that person to change. It'd be like somebody having cancer and I'm like pressuring them to change or, to get fixed. And so I think for me that is definitely a toxic behavior that I realized in a relationship, like, oh, you're trying to change this person. He doesn't need to be changed. He doesn't need to be fixed.
Wow, that's a big one. We're not rehab centers.
No.
It's not our job to fix people, you
And
know?
how much pressure did that add to him? Like for him,
Right.
I'm sure he looks at me as a toxic person in his life, but I had that badge of, oh, but I'm trying to fix you. I'm trying to save you. Right. So
Yeah.
that for me, so when I talk about that, I was part of that toxicity in that relationship. I was contributing actively to the toxicity in that relationship, but having that awareness of like, I didn't realize I was doing it. And then once I did, I was like, this, holy shit, like this is not going to change anything. It's just, I'm going to be in this continuous cycle, the
Yeah.
vicious circle that you talk about. I'm in this vicious circle, and how frustrating is it for this person? No wonder why he can't get clean. No wonder why he can't get better. Right. And it's
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I'm the one taking credit for it. So it's
Yeah.
like, then it robs him of having that win.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
yeah, of him saying
Yeah.
like, I did this and I take ownership of my winning. Like I was like, nope, you get sober, you get clean, it's because of me, right?
Right.
So
Wow.
it's like that was a huge one for me, realizing my toxic behavior in that relationship. That awareness was like, and then having that remorse. I know we talk about having remorse and how that shifts people's thinking that they want to do better, they want to be better. And I was able to leave out of that environment. So that's the example I have. What about you, Nick?
So I think of it as traits. We all have traits, some more than others. Some are negative, some are positive. With narcissism, for example, a narcissist would never know that they even have an issue, nor would they care. So they wouldn't care at all. They would hurt you and it would be okay. And it's your problem, not mine. And so some of us have traits of that, but we don't have full-blown narcissism, where you have this trait of, yeah, I might hurt you intentionally, but I do care, and I want to shift it. You might be conscious of your behaviors, still do it, but have a desire to transform it and shift it into something else. That's more of a trait than a full-blown diagnosis. There was a psychologist that I met with that he said you can have traits for a lot of things, but it doesn't merit the diagnosis, because once you have the diagnosis, that means you're full on that thing. And then we take those labels and we live into those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so to label somebody as toxic, or to label ourselves as toxic, I don't think that's healthy either. I think we might have traits that are toxic. Like we have traits that would erode a relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
so looking at those traits and being able to step back and say, yeah, I do this thing. If there's no communication with somebody, then I get scared. And then when I get scared, I start to get clingy. When I get clingy, it pushes them away. And that would be considered a toxic behavior, because it's one of those behaviors that undermines everything that you're trying to create. So we talked about self-sabotage. To me, that would be one of those things. It's one of those walking away from something that's actually good for you. That self-sabotage would be a toxic behavior. And so how do you shift that?
Yeah, it definitely is. I think having compassion, I think we beat ourselves up so much. I talk about trading in your judgment, your curiosity. Let's
Yeah.
have Nicole get curious about what her behavior instead of judging it, right? And mine stems from trauma, like that's a trauma response to what I went through as a child, but I wasn't willing to face that, right? So I
Yeah.
think getting curious and having compassion for yourself is huge when it comes to shifting the behavior, the
That's
self-awareness and the curiosity instead of the judgment.
Yeah, that's a great thing right there. Susan Anderson, if you follow her work, she talks about abandonment. And internally, for me, I grew up 11 kids. My dad died when I was 2. Like, this is a story I could tell and I could live into, and people would be like, "Oh, Nick, yeah, it totally makes sense, and you're justified. You can stay in that," right?
Mhm.
But I could see where some of these behaviors come from. Like when you have neglect, it's just as impactful as trauma, and when it comes to the body response. And so all of these things add up and they create this outcome called, clinginess or abandonment or codependence or whatever it might look like. And it doesn't mean that that has to stay. It's just like what she says in her work is that when people come out of a relationship, let's say a divorce, there's a form of trauma in that. And some of their old behaviors from childhood are going to show up in that. And so to be able to give yourself grace for that idea that you're experiencing a form of trauma coming out of a relationship or a loss of a job or anything like that, that you're going to go through this shattering phase, this withdrawal, this internalization, this rage, and then this lifting. But a lot of people get stuck in that SWIR, the shattering, withdrawal, internalization, and rage, and they don't lift. They don't come out of it.
Yeah.
And so that's where there's an opportunity to really look in the mirror and say, okay, what can I do for myself to shift this? And sometimes it's not a lone job. I mean, if you had help along the way to shift your behaviors.
I've had like self-help books. I mean, when I was in a situation where I had drug dealers beating on the door and I didn't have, money for diapers. So it was like I didn't have the resources to hire a coach or hire a mentor. So I was reading books by Dr. Wayne Dyer or watching him on PBS, or I was reading the 4 Agreements.
Yeah.
I went a lot with books, right, until I could afford a coach or
Yeah.
afford a
Wow.
therapist for it. So I knew I wanted to change. I knew I wanted to change it. But it's a lot faster when I, did go to the therapist, or I I did get a coach, it just excels. It's like the Rubik's Cube that you talk about, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
started from what I had with what I had, until I could afford to go to a coach or a therapist.
Yeah. You talked about before the show that inventory and that real look of where you are, because when you take an inventory and you tell the truth about where you are,
Mhm.
then it pushes you to one, feel really bad about where you're at, which isn't a negative thing. That grief about where you're at actually can push you to change. Like that heaviness. The word grief and gratitude, they both come from the same root word, which is weight and heaviness. And one is a positive and the other is a negative. The grief actually isn't really a negative. It's just a way of mourning what was lost, that heaviness. But gratitude adds value to that heaviness and brings you out, right? So when you can look at your reality the way that it is and not make up stories about it, then you can start to shift from that. That inventory might not look very good, it might not feel very good,
No.
but that's where you start from, right?
Yeah, and that's where it comes in to get curious instead of judgmental, because
Oh,
if we
wow.
just
Yeah.
approach it as we're gonna get curious and we're not gonna judge. I mean, when you're in guilt, shame, fear, disappointment, embarrassment, like that pulls you into self-sabotage. Those 5 emotions take you out of your power. So if you're
Yeah.
approaching your inventory of yourself and you're coming from a place of shame and guilt, it's more difficult and more painful. But if you're looking at it with curiosity and compassion, it can become something that's beautiful, a beautiful way to look at some of these ugly things. Like for me, finding out this was trauma as a child, how much compassion did I have for that little girl who was
Yeah.
just trying to fix her situation? I
Right.
just brought that behavior from that 7-year-old little girl into adulthood, right?
Yeah.
But if I would have looked at it with guilt and shame about it, it would have been much scarier.
Yeah. So things like that, like being able to hold space for it. Looking at what you're putting in your body is a big factor. Certain chemicals are going to have a response in your body that might feel or might bring up some of the neural pathways that have been buried. And feel as you go through withdrawals on certain chemicals, you're going to feel some of those deep emotions, and you might spiral. You might add more of that chemical to it just to feel good. It's called chasing the dragon, I think is what they call it in drug use. You might chase that dragon just to feel good, but every time you do, then you're adding more of that withdrawal to it, and it makes it harder to come out of it, because that your body cleansing out those chemicals is going to add to your emotional well-being. Like you're going to start thinking that I'm broken because your body is just trying to clear chemicals.
Mhm.
And so being conscious of what you put in your body is very important. Diet, nutrition, exercise, things like that can help. Do you have other thoughts?
That was huge. No, I was gonna say that nutrition and exercise is huge for me,
Yeah.
overcoming toxic behaviors in my life, getting the chemicals in your body leveled out. I know that's why a lot of people go to psychiatrists, is because
Yeah.
the chemical imbalance in their body, and they can get something to support them with those changes. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. And it might be good to be on medication for it. So you'd want to talk to a psychiatrist about that, because yeah, there may be a chemical imbalance in your body where you do need that balanced out. And
Mhm.
so some of the things that I'm collecting out of this is, one, eliminate the label, like hold some space that that toxic behavior is just behavior. It's not so fun. It might be negative, but we label it toxic and then we walk away from it. It's like we throw a grenade into the conversation. You're toxic, and blow it up and then walk away. It's not like that. Really look at that person. Is there a way to have compassion for that person? If there's not, then walk away, definitely. But it's more within yourself. Like when you can have that compassion for yourself of, this is pretty normal for what you've been through, but how do you keep from putting it over on somebody else?
Mhm.
And how do you resolve it within you? And some of these tools can help with that. Any other thoughts around it?
I was just going to say you can detach from people who maybe are not contributing to a relationship with compassion and with love. You can love. My grandmother, she used to say detach with love. So
Uh,
if someone doesn't want to change, maybe they realize their behavior, but they don't want to change, you can still have compassion for them and still walk away from the relationship. It
yeah,
doesn't have to be
yeah,
a
yeah,
negative
yeah.
cutting off. Yeah.
I'm with you on that. I'm glad you brought that up. There are a lot of resources online, so check those out as well. But really look at the toxic behavior, not from an external thing, but when you can, as a giant, look at how you're contributing to toxic behaviors and look for ways to shift that in you. How can you show up more powerfully? Because that, if each of us can do that for ourselves, that shows up in the world and it adds up. And so look at how to eliminate your own toxic behaviors before trying to fix everybody else. You're not the rehab center, right?
Yeah, and asking for help. Like
Yeah,
I like talk over people, especially my husband. And when I realized it, I'm like, when I do this, will you please
yeah,
like tell me or do something so that, because I just have that moment of like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it again. Right. So
yeah.
you can enroll people around you too to support.
I like that. Yeah, perfect. Okay, Giants, thanks for being on. Make it a giant day. We'll see you in the next video.
Love you guys.